Kill her. That's all you have to do.
Kill Mary?
She's a risk. And get the priest as well. And that altar boy who stands on the far left. That guy is a real dickhead. The world's a better place without him. Get him as well. And also get the cleaning lady. Last week I slipped on the floor and she made it sound like it was all my fault. But she hadn't put out the sign yet, the wet floor sign. So get her too.
Wait. Okay, hang on. Alright, Mary, priest, altar boy, cleaning lady. Okay.
And her little dog as well.
Oh, and the dog. Are you sure you want to get the dog? I mean, animal cruelty.
All right. Forget about the dog. Leave the cleaning lady out of it. And I guess we don't really need to worry about the altar boy as well. So just the priest and Mary, and that'll be fine.
Okay, so no dog, no cleaning lady, no altar boy. Just Mary and the priest. All right, got it.
All right. So, maybe I'll call you in a couple of days and find out how things went. All right. Sounds good. So, keep in touch.
Okay, bye.
Greetings, and welcome to another episode of Music is a Journey. I'm Peter Scove, and today's topic is going to be progressive metal, the top 25 bands of progressive metal. Previously, I made lists of the top 25 black metal albums of all time, the top 25 old school death metal albums, and the top 25 thrash metal albums of the 1980s. And the way I compiled these lists was very simply to go out and take a look at other lists on the internet. And albums that appeared the most often were ranked highest up on the list, and those that appeared 4, 3, 2 times were much lower down on the list. So I've taken the same approach for the top 25 progressive metal bands. Now, before we get started with the list, I want to cover a little bit about the history, the evolution of progressive metal, because progressive metal is about as old as heavy metal itself is. First of all, if you go to the Prog archives and take a look at proto-prog bands, and then go to the metal music archives and take a look at proto-metal bands, you will find some bands overlap. Two of the most prominent ones that come to mind are Vanilla Fudge and Iron Butterfly. Now, Vanilla Fudge, they used heavy, hard guitar sounds, as well as these big sweeping organ sounds. They had a kind of like gospel, soulful vocal style contrasted with a more rough-edged vocal style. Early on, Vanilla Fudge took a lot of recognized pop songs and transformed them into longer compositions, of course also known for the drumming and the guitar playing. And they recorded some pretty heavy riffs during their short tenure from about 1967 to 69-70. Iron Butterfly on the West Coast were more of a psychedelic band, using farfisa organ and often employing fuzz-tone guitar sounds. And of course, their major contribution to heavy metal would be the riff for In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. But Iron Butterfly also played a lot of other pretty heavy and distorted riffs. As well, they experimented with song structures, not only the lengthy kind of jam instrumental session that was In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida, but also on their third album, Ball, in 1969, they incorporated many different styles into their music. Now in 1969, we see both the beginnings of the first wave of heavy metal as well as the beginnings of progressive rock. And there is no better example of the combination of the two than King Crimson's debut album, In the Court of the Crimson King, and the song 21st Century Schizoid Man, which has a monster heavy riff as well as very scratchy vocals, but also this wild kind of jazz breakout section in there. Now, King Crimson would go on to be known as one of the foremost progressive rock bands, but they are also frequently mentioned in proto-metal conversations. Now, 1969 was also a big year, 1969-1970, for a lot of other bands who wanted to create songs that had longer compositions, combining jazz and classical elements, going for tempo changes and time signature changes and odd time signatures in the music. But at the same time, they also frequently employed heavy distorted guitar riffs, lots of lead breaks for the guitars, technical drumming, and some of those bands were the likes of Andromeda, T2, High Tide, an obscure band like Necromandus, Bodkin, and of course the two big ones, Deep Purple and Uriah Heep. All of these bands, in some form or another, incorporated classical influences, sometimes jazz influences, but as well also played heavier guitar parts. Now, even Black Sabbath eventually started to pick up on the progressive bit, and by about 1972, their album Volume 4 is considered by many to be the beginnings of Black Sabbath venturing into progressive rock territory. However, by 1972, the first wave of heavy metal was actually dying out, and a lot of bands were turning either into progressive rock bands, dissolving altogether, or just moving on into a more hard rock and roll type music style. However, by the mid-70s, we still see traces of progressive metal hanging around, or at least progressive proto-metal, in the likes of Rainbow, early Judas Priest recordings, a few other ones too, a band like Angel, which later on turned into more of a glam rock band. Their early beginnings featured some more heavy, hard guitar playing, as well as more extended pieces with a little bit more complex arrangements than what you would find in your standard hard rock band of the day. Now, 1975-76 is really important in the history of progressive metal because, of course, that's when Rush began recording with Neil Peart on drums and started to expand their hard rock palette into the progressive territory quite deliberately. And by 1977, 78, they were a full-blown progressive rock band, however, still including some of the elements of hard and heavy rock as well. Now, we see not only Rush, but other bands of the time and even of the same area, Toronto. There was Triumph. They were essentially a hard rock, early heavy metal band, but at the same time, they also included longer compositions. Rick Emmett had a variety of guitar playing styles, including jazz, blues, flamenco, classical guitar, and they also did multi-part songs. We find Saga, who were basically one of the early bands of the neo-prog movement, combining pop melodies with more classically influenced or more complex synthesizer parts, and as well as the kind of hard rock guitar of Jim Crichton. Now, 1980 is an especially important year as well because that is the release of Iron Maiden's debut album. Now, Iron Maiden are not considered exactly a progressive metal band, but they are very close, often going into these longer, complex compositions, changing tempo, changing parts, changing melodies, also thematic albums, concept albums. And their debut album featured a few tracks like Phantom of the Opera, Strange World, Transylvania, which also showed off their instrumental prowess. And Iron Maiden are also extremely important in the story of progressive metal because they influenced the earliest bands in the new progressive metal scene, basically the scene that became known as progressive metal. And those bands are Queensryche, Fates Warning, Crimson Glory, and later on also Dream Theater. During the 1980s, we also saw more developments in progressive metal with bands that were not typically associated with progressive metal, but who dabbled in it, such as Metallica with their 1986 album Master of Puppets. Some more lengthy compositions, more change-ups in the music, definitely moving beyond your standard heavy metal tracks of the day. One of the most important bands, however, would happen to be Voivod out of Quebec, who grew up in an entirely different environment. You see, Quebec was a real hotspot for progressive rock during the 1970s. And then around the early 80s, there was a strong punk rock movement in Quebec. So when heavy metal came along really strongly in Quebec in the 1980s, we see that Voivod combined their speed metal, thrash metal, science fiction metal approach starting to blend in some of these hardcore punk as well as progressive elements by their third album, Killing Technology, and their next two albums, Dimension Hatros and Nothing Face, are considered very important albums in the development of progressive metal, but also in a way that no other band, I think, was able to mimic until much later on. Anyway, that brings us up to Dream Theater in the last half of the 90s. First album out in 1989, and Dream Theater did what Rush did. They exactly took their love for hard and heavy music and combined it with their love for progressive music. And Dream Theater went on to be known as one of the seminal bands, if not the most important band in the progressive metal scene, playing very technical music, going for longer conceptual pieces, concept albums, and so on. So that will take us up into the 90s, and from there on, the story just continues. So now, I think it's time to take a look at that list of bands. Now, when we talk about progressive metal, there is a different approach than when we talk about other subgenres like black metal or death metal. In those subgenres, we often have like more sub-genres, and they are generally considered to be part of the whole. For example, in black metal, you have your traditional black metal. You also have symphonic black metal. You have atmospheric black metal. These days, there's also like black gaze, blackened thrash, blackened death, all sorts of variations. Typically, though, the more true to black metal bands are considered in there. However, others certainly can make the list. However, I noticed when looking at progressive metal, it's actually separate. The subgenres are separated. For example, you have the heavy prog section. These are not exactly heavy metal bands or metal bands, but they use elements of heavy metal in their music, such as Uriah Heep and Rush, but also a band like Toxic Smile. Then you get onto the traditional, I guess, progressive metal bands, and the bands that I'm going to talk about today are those types of bands. So you'll get a good feel for that once we get into the list. But then you also get your more technical, extreme bands, such as the technical death metal bands of Beyond Creation, Obscura. You have a lot of the heavier bands like Edge of Insanity, Opeth. However, because Opeth are one of the big bands in the progressive metal scene, they actually do make this list. However, there are a lot of other more extreme bands that didn't fall into this list, and in some cases, I even read that the list makers chose to keep them as on a separate list altogether. All right. Then let's take a look at these top 25 bands. Now, with the previous lists, I started from the 25th position and worked my way up to first place. In this case here, we're going to start from the most prominent band and work our way backwards, because probably it's no surprise who number one is. The number one progressive metal band on the list is, of course, Dream Theater. Now, when I made the list, I checked how many times Dream Theater albums appeared on lists of top progressive metal albums. Now, let's see here. 9 Images and Words. This album appeared on 9 of the 12 lists that I checked. And falling shortly behind that, there was also Metropolis Part 2, Scenes from a Memory, a concept album. Really cool story on here. I really like this one. This is actually my favorite Dream Theater album. And another album that was frequently mentioned, let me see here how many times. Awake was actually mentioned on only 2 lists of top 25s, but it did appear on other lists going beyond 25, like top 50s and top 100s. And also their 8th album, Octavarium, appeared once, which is one of my favorite Dream Theater albums as well. What can we say? Well, there's a lot to say about Dream Theater, but I'm not going to make this into a Dream Theater special. So just taking a look at my notes here, it looks like we had 18 albums mentioned in the top 10 or top 25 lists that I checked. 12 lists, 18 albums. Obviously that means that Dream Theater albums sometimes appeared twice on a particular list. The band that was next most included on lists is Symphony X, and this album here, The Divine Wings of Tragedy, this one actually appeared as many as 7 times on those 12 lists. And as well, another album of theirs, oh yes, The Odyssey appeared at least once, and their 5th album, well, I don't know if you'd read it as V or 5, but anyway, the New Mythology Suite, it also appeared, let me see, twice, anyway. But certainly if you are going to get into progressive metal, you want to check it out. Dream Theater's Images and Words and Symphony X's The Divine Wings of Tragedy are important albums to check out. Both of them from the 1990s, I'll add. I think I should also mention Symphony X's album here. This is one of those cross-genre albums because you'll find it listed in progressive metal albums, you'll find it listed on power metal albums, and you will also find it listed on symphonic metal albums. So this is a triple genre spanning album here. So then, as I mentioned, one of the most important bands in this new phase of progressive metal, the kind of official progressive metal phase, is of course Queensryche. And the album that just gets mentioned, well, 7 out of 12 lists anyway, Operation Mindcrime, which was Queensryche's third full-length album. This is also a concept story. A Dr. X who has a plan to change the world hires a young recovering junkie named Nikki who falls in love with a nun named Mary. And yeah, it's an interesting story. I remember picking this up back when it first came out. We were really thrilled about it. It was really cool to hear a concept album that included dialogue and sound effects and so on in 1988. I mean, for us at that time, this was a big thing. I also was into Queensryche right from the get-go when I first heard something from their EP back in 1983, I think it was. And I remember in my grade 8 English class, we had to write a short essay about something, and I wrote why I thought Queensryche was the best band for me at the time. Anyway, Operation Mindcrime, their album Empire also gets mentioned, and I believe The Warning also appeared once, and Promised Land appeared once, but not on a top 25. Queensryche, one of the important early bands in the progressive metal movement from the 1980s on. Alright, we are not going to get away without mentioning Opeth, a band I was really into just a few years ago. Got a t-shirt. And of course, Opeth are very interesting because not only did they change their music style a lot over the course of their heavy metal career, they also just completely dropped it and went into solid prog rock, retro prog territory. Michael Åkerfeldt has a big interest in all these obscure bands from the late 60s and early 70s, so he has a lot from which to draw influences. The album that simply gets mentioned, 6 times on 12 of those lists, Blackwater Park. Also, the previous album to that, Still Life, that was their 4th album, also got mentioned, I'm staring at my computer now, 4 times. And then also Ghost Reveries got mentioned 3 times, and Watershed was mentioned once as well. Opeth are a really important band for me because I was really into the extreme metal scene up until somewhere around 1986-87, and by the end of the 80s, early 90s, I was kind of losing interest in it, and then I stayed away from the extreme metal scene for a long time. However, after exploring progressive rock and getting into Opeth, then I went into Opeth's heavier albums. And from there on, I actually learned to appreciate the death growl vocals and the really extremely heavy music. And so, thanks to Opeth, I am back into extreme metal and all kinds of heavy metal again. Alright, I'm sure if you ask someone to mention progressive metal bands, you are going to hear about Tool and their album Lateralus. Here it is in the special case. Can I take it out? Like that. There we go, Lateralus. This is the most frequently mentioned album, mentioned 6 times of those 12 lists. As well, their album, how do you pronounce this now? Anima, I guess. I was corrected by someone the last time I mispronounced it, so I probably mispronounced it again. But there you have it. This album was also mentioned, and as well, 10,000 Days was mentioned once, this one twice, and this one 6 times. Probably, well, I mean, Tool, it's just there was so much excitement over their last album. They are really highly regarded, especially by fans of the band. This is, yeah, something very different. You don't hear really many other bands playing this style. Okay, next up we have another fairly important band on the list. This is Between the Buried and Me, and I only have this one album here, the Parallax 2, Future Sequence. This one showed up twice, And as well, their album Colors showed up 5 times on different lists. I was really interested in hearing it, but it's apparently very difficult to get a hold of. It's out there selling in mint condition for something like $60, $70, $80. So unless I want to get a download, I don't know, probably gonna have to wait for that one there. But anyway, this one here, this is a very exciting album. Lots of twists and turns in the music. You get very tight, progressive, extreme metal type music with kind of a metalcore sound, death growl vocals, and if you don't know Between the Buried and Me, you gotta strap yourself in before you listen to this one, or listen to Colors. And I think one of their other albums showed up as well. The Great Misdirect was mentioned once, which I believe is available. A little bit surprising to find this band so much farther down the list. However, still in the top 10, this is Fate's Warning. Fate's Warning were, of course, one of those early bands to emerge. I think their first album came out in 1984. Awaken the Guardian was 1986, and this is one of the highly regarded progressive metal albums. That's pretty cool that it came out in 1986. Early on, Fate's Warning had a kind of strong, I think, Maiden influence, and honestly, I find their early albums very similar to Queensryche, just I find this one here to be more technical and perhaps a little bit heavier in some ways as well. Queensryche and Fate's Warning had a kind of similar beginning and then branched out into their own respective sounds. Fate's Warning, this is Awaken the Guardian. The album that gets mentioned the most is Awaken the Guardian, appeared 4 times on the list. No Exit, which was the album after this, appeared twice, and their album Parallels, which I don't have. Their album Symmetry, which I don't have, was actually mentioned once or twice, maybe not exactly in the top 25. Parallels also was mentioned once. I'm honestly not such a big fan of this one here. In fact, this was my first Fate's Warning album, and it just about put me off the band altogether. This is also said to be where they took away a lot of their heaviness and tried to, and it was kind of more of a lighter album. So maybe I just stumbled into that, which was, I should have started out with No Exit, or maybe Symmetry, or Awaken the Guardian. This one here is quite brilliant. Alright, Fate's Warning, still going strong these days as well. I think no list of progressive metal albums would be complete without the mention of Pain of Salvation. This one here, Remedy Lane. Remedy Lane actually appeared on 4 of those 12 lists, and The Perfect Element, Part 1, appeared twice on 2 of those 12 lists, and one other album, Entropia, also appeared twice on those lists. So, Pain of Salvation. Again, quite a different sounding band. A lot of this is actually quite light. It's almost, I would say it's very much like progressive glam metal, but without all the fun sound of glam. A lot of this is quite depressing music, really. Anyway, it's not as heavy as some of the other bands we've talked about. Pain of Salvation. Okay, another really important band in the progressive metal scene is Arion. And here we have Into the Electric Castle. Let me see, Into the Electric Castle appeared twice, but The Human Equation appeared 4 times. And also mentioned was 01011001, which was mentioned twice. Arion, every album that I'm aware of anyway, is basically a rock opera or progressive metal opera. They have guest vocalists coming in playing different parts. There's a story that plays out during the course of the album. And just to make things even wilder than that, a lot of the stories actually belong to one overarching story. So they all read like chapters, actually like individual books in a book series, which is pretty cool. Okay, so that's Arion. Actually, this was very cool album, I thought, because it included a lot of singers that I know, and it also featured Devin Townsend, whom I really didn't have any interest in until I heard him singing on this album here, and from then on, I became a fan. So, now that we've mentioned Devin Townsend, we can take a look at his Ocean Machine Biomech album. This was his first solo album while he was still doing the Strapping Young Lad Band, which is a really extreme metal, industrial metal type band. This one here was his other side. So there's a lot more melody in here, and a very different sounding album. The one that gets talked about the most is Teria, another solo album. I think it was his fourth true solo album. Let me see. Teria got mentioned 4 times. Ocean Machine and Biotech was mentioned. Whoops, where'd we go? Ocean Machine and Biotech. Biomech was mentioned twice, as well. Ziltoid the Omniscient actually appeared on 2 of those lists. And there was also mention, I have it, I just didn't take it out. There was also mention of the Devin Townsend Project album, Deconstructed. There it is. Which, kind of like Arian, features a lot of different guest vocalists. And this is just an insane album where he just went all out to put in long songs with lots of wild changes in the music. Guest vocalists playing different parts in a wacky story about a vegetarian who goes to hell. Yeah. Okay, that's Devin Townsend. Okay, another band that falls more into the extreme category, at least early on in their history, is Mastodon. This album here, Leviathan, this is basically a sludge metal album, which is the reason why I bought it, because I thought, what is sludge metal? Several years ago when I was checking out what was happening in heavy metal at the time. I really like this one here. The album that gets talked about the most is Crack the Sky. I find I prefer the sound on this one more, so I haven't gotten into this one as much. However, Crack the Sky, let's see here, got mentioned 4 times, and Leviathan got mentioned twice. There were other Mastodon albums that also made it on some lists of top 50s or top 100, so still an important band in the progressive metal scene. And if you watch the Banger TV episode about progressive metal, part of the Headbangers Journey series, I believe Mastodon is featured right from the get-go. Well, we go on to feature one of my favorite bands in the progressive metal scene. This is Voivod. I told you before, Dimension Hatros and especially Nothing Face are the most recognized albums of theirs in the progressive metal scene. I was into Voivod right from the beginning. I went into the store, found their War and Pain album and picked it up and thought, wow, this is really cool. Who's doing music like this? And went in and out of Voivod for the next few years, buying an album, missing an album, buying an album, missing an album. But a few years back, I decided to just go ahead and check out almost all of their catalog. And their most recent release, 2018, The Wake, actually got mentioned on some lists as well. Just again, not in the top 25. But I have to say, The Wake is a really brilliant album and shows that Voivod can actually still develop new music, new styles, new sounds for themselves. So the list of important bands in progressive metal does continue. One of the most important bands is Haken. I have their album Aquarius and The Mountain. I love The Mountain. This is brilliant. However, let me see here. Haken Visions was actually mentioned on 3 of those lists. I don't have that album yet. The Mountain was mentioned twice, and Aquarius was mentioned once. And of course, they have a few other albums out, a couple of other albums out. Really cool band, a band that can write 9-10 minute long songs that have all sorts of change-ups going on. And this one I really like because there's such diversity in the sound. You have these almost like Gregorian chant styles as well, piano parts, so this is a real treat to listen to. Visions, most often mentioned one, maybe I should get that. Now here's a band I haven't really gotten into yet. This is Leprous, and this is their album The Congregation. I like it. I don't really love it. However, their previous album to this, what was it called now? Bilateral? That actually was mentioned on 3 of those 12 lists. So maybe I should give Leprous another chance and check out Bilateral. And I know there are a lot of people out there who think these guys are really brilliant. So I probably just haven't found the album to ensnare me yet. And probably once I do, I will look at this one in a new light. Nevertheless, Leprous are one of those bands, one of those newer bands in the progressive metal scene that are getting a fair bit of attention out there. Frequently mentioned anyway in the progressive metal conversation. There is Meshuggah. This is Destroy, Erase, Improve. This is the only Meshuggah album I have. Another album, Chaosphere, was also mentioned. This was mentioned once. Chaosphere was mentioned once. However, one of their albums called Obzen, their album Obzen was mentioned 2 times. And Chaosphere and this one were mentioned 1 time. Meshuggah, of course, are important because they are basically regarded as the band who kicked off the whole djent movement. Am I saying that correctly? Djent. Anyway, which is not really exactly a style, it's more of a guitar sound. However, there are a lot of bands who employ that sound in their playing, and so because of that, it's kind of turned into a subgenre. Anyway, Meshuggah, also a favorite band of Devin Townsend's. Now we're going to get into the bands who were only mentioned, their albums were only mentioned 2 or 3 times on those lists. And one of the bands is Riverside. This is their, I think it's their second album, Second Life Syndrome. They did actually start out more as a progressive metal band, and then gradually over the years they've weaned out the heavier side and become more of a progressive rock band. Actually, one of their other albums a little bit after this, now I've forgotten the name, I really like that one even better than this one. But yeah, Second Life Syndrome, let me see here, Riverside. Second Life Syndrome was mentioned twice, and Anno Domini High Definition was also mentioned twice. Gojira, this album here, From Mars to Sirius, this one appeared on 2 of the lists, and one of their other albums, The Way of the Flesh, also was mentioned on one of those lists here. Gojira, yeah, this is a band that also gets a lot of mention and is fairly highly regarded. I think Brittany Slays of Unleash the Archers recently said that she's been listening to Gojira a lot. Anyway, this is certainly a really cool album, and I love the vocal style on here as well. Okay, in the mid-90s, Edge of Sanity, one of the first of the new melodic progressive melodic death metal bands, melodic progressive death metal bands. Anyway, this one here, the album Crimson, this is just basically a 45-minute song. Just one long song. This album appeared on 2 of the lists, and the album Crimson 2 appeared once. Edge of Sanity there. I think Michael Akefeld of Opeth also appears as a guest on this album. Okay, we're coming down now to the bands that only had 1 album mentioned, but actually mentioned twice. So one of them here is Evergray with In Search of Truth. This is a story about a man who was abducted by aliens and how he is trying to deal with that experience, and as well, the aliens coming back to visit him again. Pretty cool album. I love these concept albums, and they have things like a kind of spoken recording of him being really scared. I don't know, just lots of really cool music on here. And really, I've been thinking I should get another Evergray album because they sound pretty good. One of those early on branching out from extreme metal albums, this is Cynic's Focus. They are included in death metal. But again, one of these bands that just started branching out, doing more technical stuff, along with Atheist and Death. And in fact, Atheist and Death are also considered in the more extreme progressive metal lists. Not mentioned here, though, but 2 very important bands. Cynic, however, somehow managed to make it in with Focus being mentioned twice. Hello, Kurama, my cat. He only meowed once today. Periphery. Their album Periphery 2, this made it on a couple of lists. I actually bought it because they were on a list by Loudwire, which was the first list I consulted, and originally I was thinking to make this video about that list. However, I later on changed my mind. Periphery 2, this band also I think shares similarities in sound with a band called Tesseract. Clean vocals, more growly vocals, lots of technical playing, bit on the djenty side from time to time, a very modern metal sound, I would say. Yeah, check it out. Alright, a band that I find to be quite similar to Between the Buried and Me is Protest the Hero. And this album of theirs, Fortress, this was mentioned on a couple of lists as well. 1 or 2 of their other albums was also mentioned, but again, not in the top 25. This is a band also featuring the kind of metalcore sound and very fast, quick change-ups in the music, quite similar to Between the Buried and Me. I tend to favor them a little bit more, mostly because they're Canadian. And also because I can get their albums more easily than Between the Buried and Me. Animals as Leaders, I only have the 2nd album here, but it was their debut album that actually was mentioned twice on some lists. And of course, this is an album that just features an insane guitarist who I think he's playing with 8 strings, 10 strings, fingers just going all over the place. Pretty cool stuff if you haven't heard Animals as Leaders and you want to hear something really mind-blowing, so you could check it out. All right, as we come down near the end, Iron Maiden. They did actually get in here. This album, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, appears in progressive metal conversations. Some consider it to be their most progressive album. It is, of course, a concept album, so that wins them points for that. Some people I've heard say it is not a true progressive metal album, but nevertheless, Iron Maiden do have that tendency to go into more involved instrumental passages and lots of different change-ups in the music, things that you would find in progressive metal. So this one here actually got mentioned on 2 lists as well, including the Loudwire list I mentioned. Okay, that's basically the 25 bands. I think that should be 25. Maybe Iron Maiden was 26. Here comes the cat again. But one band that actually often gets mentioned in progressive metal conversations, but and actually appeared in top 50 or top 100 lists, but strangely enough didn't appear in any of the top 25 lists I talked about. I consulted. Threshold. And what do we have here? Hypothetical and March of Progress. 2 of their albums. Basically, those lists included maybe this album, or maybe this album, or maybe another album. I think there were about 4 different Threshold albums that got mentioned in those lists, top 50s or top 100s, but never any one particular album. For my opinion, Threshold are not really that progressive when you compare them to like Fate's Warning or Dream Theater. However, they still do have the longer compositions and keyboard parts and a number of other aspects of progressive metal. So I thought it's a shame in a way that they didn't make the top 25 bands, because they were mentioned a lot. So here they are, Threshold. I'm going to mention them. Okay, as I said, there are a lot of other bands like Death or Atheist, and more technical bands like Beyond Creation or Obscura. Lots of other bands that you would probably think should be on the list that didn't appear. But anyway, as I said, this is what I gathered from a dozen lists on the internet of the bands that were most frequently mentioned, or the albums that were most frequently mentioned. So there you have it. If you're interested in checking out progressive metal or delving more deeply into it, there is a list of 25, well actually 26 bands that you should be checking out. Okay, and that does it for today's episode. So I'm going to be back again later with another episode about heavy metal, because I'm doing this. 2020 is considered the 50th anniversary of heavy metal, so that's also my first love in music. Why not talk about it then? Okay, anyway, again, thanks for watching. Everybody stay safe, take care, and hopefully see you in the next video. Bye.